Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're at, in your home, watching on your TV, your laptop, or your phone, you are a part of this family. And you can watch and listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists and search for past messages and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to Cornerstone America's podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family.
I have entitled today's sermon, Consider My Servant. All right. And we're going to be in Job 1 and 2. And I am going to do a considerable amount of reading in that, but we're going to stop at different times and examine those scriptures. But what I want to focus on here is Job's friends. You know, Job's friends get a bad rap most of the time when they're talked about in church. But they're not all bad. They did some good. So we're going to talk a lot about them. And I thought this was also fitting because over the last couple of years, there has been a lot of suffering that we have experienced. Whether it be personal suffering of not being able to do the things you've always wanted to do, or whether it be physical suffering of losing family members, etc. And so we're going to look at Job and his suffering. And I know some of y'all are probably like, oh, Job, great, we're Debbie Downer today. But we're going to try not to be that, all right? So if we'll get right into it, those of you who have a Bible with you, we are in Job 1. I welcome you to read along with me. As I said, there's going to be some of the verses that are not on the screen. All right, so it starts off immediately with talking about who Job is. We don't have a whole lot of backstory about how Job got to the point where he is. But in Job 1:1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and no one feared God, and one who feared God and shunned evil. All right, so a little definition there. Let's look at blameless. That means innocent of wrongdoing. Job had not done anything wrong. Now, I'm not saying he was sin-free, okay, but he was blameless, which means in God's eyes here, he's been repentant of the things that he has done wrong. All right, he's blameless, hasn't done anything to deserve punishment. All right, reading on, it says, and 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So that this man was the greatest of all the people in the east. He was rich. All right, he was loaded. He was a very, very prominent man in this area and very, very wealthy. All right, reading on in verse 4, it says, and his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day. Remember, he had 7 sons, 3 daughters, all right? And would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. All right, and this is where we pick up on your screen there. It says, so it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, all right, that's the days of feasting that Job's sons and daughters were going through, that Job would send and sanctify them. He would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. Job knew he had an obligation not just to be blameless himself, he had an obligation to his family. And if his family wasn't going to live right, he was going to offer sacrifices for them. And it says there that he did that regularly. All right, it wasn't a passing thing. It wasn't just when he felt like he needed to. He did it regularly. He was praying for his children. He was lifting up his children before God regularly. All right, reading on in verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where did you come?" Satan answered and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, and blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil?" All right, he calls him his servant. I listed a couple definitions of a servant there for you. This is a person who performs duties for others. So he was performing duties for God. All right. As a noun, it means one who serves or ministers. He was serving God. All right. So Job's blameless. He's a servant. All right. In verse 9, it says, "So Satan answered the Lord and said, 'Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in your land? But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you and your face.'" Satan said, he's happy, he's blameless, he's sinless because he has it all. All right? He has it all. He has no reason to be upset. But if you take that away from him, he'll curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Verse 13, "Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house. And a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing, the donkeys feeding beside them. So everything's going as planned, when the Sabeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone escaped to tell you.'" So he has somebody come and tell him all his oxen, all his donkeys, all the servants that are tending those, but me, are dead. While he was still speaking, while that servant was still speaking, another also came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another also came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, and took them away. Yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you." 4 instances there of things just being destroyed. 2 by natural causes, fire and wind. 2 by enemies, the Sabeans and the Chaldeans. So Job essentially has his wife and 4 servants now. He has lost everything. All right, and this is where we pick up on the slides. "Then Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and fell to the ground and worshiped." How many of us would have reacted like that? He's lost everything in a day with servants coming to him, telling him everything's been lost. And he worshiped. And worship is the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. Reverence and adoration for a deity. His first instinct when everything was gone was to turn to God. He adored him. He revered him. And then he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Holy, consecrated is the name of the Lord. I'm just going to be honest with you. I don't know if I'd have reacted that way. All right? And if we're honest with ourselves, I think most of us would say we probably wouldn't have reacted that way. And then it says, "In all this, Job did not sin nor charge God with wrong." Okay? He didn't say, God, this is all your fault. That doesn't mean Job doesn't have questions. If you read the rest of the book, he's going to question. But he never sinned in doing so. It's not wrong to ask questions, but it's wrong to blame God and call him out for it. Okay? Let's move on to chapter 2 now, and we're getting into where there'll be a little bit of the meat of what I wanted to say today with you. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. All right, so Satan's already taken everything away from Job. Remember, God told him first, don't touch Job. Touch all that he has, but don't touch him. Satan came among those sons of men to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, from where did you come? He said, from going to and fro on the earth and walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. Sounds like the exact same conversation. And still he holds fast to his integrity, although you enticed me against him to destroy him without cause. All right, he said, you incited me against him to destroy him without cause. He's still blameless. He holds fast to his integrity. Verse 4, so Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yes. All that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your hand, but spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. All right, he's in torment. Now, mind you, this is what he said to Satan, spare his life. That's it. He said, spare his life. So don't you think Satan probably put on him the worst affliction of the day that wouldn't take his life? The worst one. The worst sickness imaginable of that day is what Job has here. So he's lost everything. Satan said, he'll stop following you if you touch him. God said, just don't kill him. Anything short of killing him. And he's been inflicted with this sickness. And he didn't necessarily have somebody right there next to him who was helpful. All right, verse 9. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. All right, Job knew that everything in the world comes from God. He controls it all. All right? And he received it. He received it. Never sinned in cursing God in this. Now, one thing I want to point out here is some God attributes that I see that are shown in Job's suffering. First, God is sovereign over evil. Satan had to have permission to touch him. God's sovereign over evil. Satan does not control this world. All right? God does. God is sovereign over evil. Then he limited the actions of the enemy. First he said, don't lay a hand on Job. You can do whatever you want to his possessions, to his family, but don't lay a hand on him. Then when Satan comes back, he says, don't kill him. Spare his life. All right? So he limited the actions of the enemy. And then the third thing is that every action the enemy took against Job ultimately served God's greater purpose. Every action that he took against Job served God's greater purpose. One example that I can give you is we're talking about Job right now. All right? It worked in favor of what God wanted to happen. All right? Now, let's move on to Job's friends now. Job's 3 friends. And like I said, they get a bad rap a lot of times, and we're going to get to that. We're going to get to the things that Job's friends did wrong. But they weren't all wrong in this. All right? These were some true friends. All right? Verse 13, it says, when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him. All right? First thing is that they heard. All right, these weren't people that lived close to Job. They weren't people that had Facebook. They weren't people that got a text from Job's wife saying that everything had happened. All right, they heard. And so they were obviously people who wanted to keep up with their friends. They had messengers going back and forth all the time to see what was going on with each other. And so they heard. So they were separated by some distance, but they were close enough to know that something had happened. They weren't too wrapped up in their own business. I imagine with the status that Job had, these 3 guys who are coming aren't like peasants. All right, I imagine they're probably pretty wealthy themselves. All right, and whomever was involved must have known Job's friends would have wanted to know what happened. Maybe it was one of the 4 servants that lived. Maybe it was Job's wife sent one of them to go tell them all that had happened. But the lesson here is in order to help a friend, you have to stay connected with them. You have to know what's going on with them. And Job's friends did that. All right, the second lesson we can learn from Job's friends is also in Job 2:11. It says, each one came from his own place. Eliphaz the Temite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. All right, so Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they came. All right, they didn't stay where they were when they heard about Job's suffering. They could have stayed at home and prayed for their friend, and there would have been nothing wrong with that. We're called to pray for our friends. We're called to pray for those around us. There would have been nothing wrong with them just praying. But they came. All right, instead they decided to go the extra mile. They sacrificed their own personal time for their friend. I'm sure they left their jobs and families behind. They spent their own money to travel to be with Job. The lesson here that we're learning from Job's friends is that the sacrifice of time, energy, and maybe even money is sometimes needed for friends in a time of need. All right, so they've done 2 things right here already in Job 2. And then in verse 12 it says, when they raised their eyes from afar, they did not recognize him. They lifted their voices and wept. Now, let's focus on that recognize for just a second. They didn't recognize him. This disease that Satan had put on him with these boils had rendered him unrecognizable. All right, he was sick. He was hurting. I imagine he's lost some weight in his grief and in his suffering. He's unrecognizable. All right, and as I said, this was probably the worst disease that there was in that day because Satan had full reign other than taking his life. They came, they saw him, they didn't even recognize him. All right, society is teaching us today to stay away from people who are in need. It's teaching us to stay away from people who are in need. Consider Jesus. Did he shy away from a leper? No, he went. He went and touched them. They were untouchable. You weren't supposed to be around them. You weren't supposed to touch them. You weren't supposed to talk to them. Only thing you could do is drop some coins as they were begging. He went to them, touched them, healed them. All right, so they showed the appropriate emotion is number 4. I'm sorry, Zach, we're behind. Let's go. There we go. They showed the appropriate emotion. Bible tells us when they saw Job, they couldn't recognize him. They lifted up their voices and wept for their friend. All right, here we see Job's friends seeing the situation for what it was. They were deeply grieved for him. They saw that he had lost everything. They'd already heard that he had lost everything. Now they're seeing what has happened to him personally. Skin just shredded off by him having to scrape those boils off with potsherds. All right, the lesson here is that we need to, when we have friends in need, we need to express emotion that is equal and relevant to their circumstances. All right, we need to feel for them. We need to get on their level and try to understand. We're not going to be able to completely, but we need to be there. All right, lesson number 5 is from verse 12. And each one tore his robe and sprinkled dust on his head toward heaven. All right, so they showed solidarity with Job. Now, ancient tradition dictated that in order to express grief and sorrow, you were to tear your clothes, put dust and ashes on your head. I don't suggest that you leave here today and go to somebody's house who you know is sick and outside their front door, tear your clothes, dump ashes on your head and stuff like that. I'm not insinuating that at all. All right, that was customary at that time. I don't suggest that today. You may end up in a mental hospital, all right? So I'm not suggesting that. But what I am saying is you need to show solidarity with your friends who are hurting. All right, you need to find ways to identify and connect with those who are in pain. All right, lesson number 6. And all this is happening in 2 verses here, Job 2:11 through 13. It says, so they sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. They stayed with him. They sat down with him. Remember this disease that we're talking about. All right, they sat with him. Sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. All right, this wasn't a short hospital visit. They stayed with him. Your friends in need your time. All right, so friends in pain may need you for more than a day. And this is very difficult for me to say. And like I said at the beginning of this, when you're called upon in the last minute to preach, you preach on what you're learning about for yourself and what you're studying for yourself. This is for me, y'all. We can't let busyness stop us from helping those around us. I have a very busy job, and I'll use that as an excuse sometimes. And I shouldn't. All right? I'm trying to learn here as well. All right, the 7th lesson. This is the hardest one, y'all. This is the one that every one of us probably struggles with. Job 2:13. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. How long did it say they sat with him? 7 days. Nobody said a word. Because they were going to let him initiate something being said. All right? So our first inclination in an emotional situation is to say something to make the situation better. All right? Or we get nervous, fill the dead air with the sound of our voice. And it's often in those times that we say the wrong thing. All right? And it makes situations worse. Husbands and wives, I can tell you this from experience. Husbands, your wives don't always want their problems fixed. All right? Sometimes they just want to express their problem to you, and we won't shut up We won't listen to the friends here of no one spoke a word, and we try to fix that problem immediately. All right, and they don't need that right then. They need to be able to vent. And his friends understood this about Job. They were going to let him speak first. Okay? No one spoke a word. So they recognized from the moment they arrived on the scene that he was not ready to communicate. So they just sat there with him, expressed their sympathy through silence. All right, so those are 7 things that we can do as a friend, that we can learn from Job's friends to help others. There's also some things we need to unlearn from Job's friends, okay? Their problems started when they started talking, all right? And they thought they were helping. Oftentimes, we think we're helping. You can go on to the next slide. All right, so they thought they were helping, but they weren't. Now, Job ends up getting real frustrated with them throughout the course of this story because it's a back and forth. One of the friends will say something, Job will answer. The other friend will say something, Job will answer. The third friend will say something, Job will answer. Job gets really tired of them, and probably my favorite passage in this, and me and Anita have talked about this, it's just hilarious to me. Job kind of lashes out in Job 12:2, and he says, "No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you." All right? He's like, y'all know it all. Nobody's ever going to know anything after y'all die. You know, he's being extremely sarcastic with them, obviously. He's upset with them because they're at the point now where they begin to accuse him of all these different things. And I don't have this list up there, but they accused him of sin. They accused him of being punished. They said, surely you're being punished for something. We know that's not the case because God said he was blameless. All right. They said he needed to repent. They said he had folly in his life. They said that you're wicked and the wicked are punished. So this has to be punishment. He tells them, no doubt you are the people and wisdom's going to die with you. All right. So when they opened their mouth and started talking is when they went downhill. But there's 3 false ideas that I want to bring up here that his friends had in their hearts. They may not have said these things, but I believe that these 3 things are true of them. False idea number 1 is they believed there was no Satan behind suffering. All right? They were blaming Job for it all. They said, you had to have sinned. You had to have done something wrong. You're being punished. They didn't believe that there was another force at work here. And that's not always true. Our problems aren't always the result of our choices. Sometimes they are. Not saying that our choices don't create problems, because Lord knows they do. All right? I have plenty of problems that were created by my own choices. All right? But that's not always true. Sometimes they're just a result that we live in a fallen world and that there is a force out there who wants us to be hurt. Or it could be somebody else's sinful choices. All right, so Job's friends talk a lot about God, but they never mention the accuser. The accuser is mentioned in Job several times, and literally in Hebrew, it is translated Satan. All right, so they never mention the accuser. They don't understand that there's something else. There's another force that is at work in the world. And we can forget that too. We oftentimes, when things come on us, we're like, oh my goodness, what did I do to deserve this? You may not have done anything to deserve it. It may just be that you live in a fallen world, or that Satan's attacking you. The accuser is after you. All right, so to be a Christian is to believe that evil is not just a human construct, but it has a spiritual dimension. And in Ephesians 6:12, it says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We don't wrestle against other humans. There's a force bigger out there that's trying to get to us. And they didn't realize that. They thought it had to have been something that Job did to himself. All right? And then we all know that person who is going to be bent on they had to have done something wrong for this to happen. And we need to be there for that person as well. I know people, I have people in my family who blame themselves for something bad happening. And that's just not the case. All right? In the situations that I'm referring to, it's not the case. And like I said, it's not always the case that it's something else. Sometimes we do create problems for ourselves. But then other times it's just a fallen world we live in. All right? And his friends didn't understand that. The second lesson we need to unlearn from Job's friends is that there's no final judgment. For chapter after chapter, his friends talk as if judgment is in the here and now. They said the wicked are punished in this life. The righteous are blessed now. That's why they're being so hard on him. They believe that he's being punished for something, that he's done something wrong. It has to be that way. That's the way they believe. It has to be that way. But in God's world, blessings don't always come immediately. In Galatians 6, 7 through 10, it says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever man sows, that he will also reap." Okay? So that part, maybe Job's friends were on track. But listen as he goes on. "For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. But he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." All right, it says, let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season, we're going to see the fruit of it. All right? And it's not going to be in our time, y'all. As much as we want it to be in our time, we want it to happen when we want it to happen, that's not the case. God's in control. He's sovereign. He's sovereign over evil, and he's sovereign over you. All right, so we can see there in God's word that judgment is delayed also. All right, judgment delayed, though, is not judgment denied. God's going to have the final word. Okay, he's not going to let evil win. So judgment delayed is not judgment denied. Every unrepentant mass murderer, child abuser, heresy teaching pastor, they'll all be punished, just not always when we want it to happen and not always in the here and now. Okay? We see this in Matthew 13, 24 through 30 with the parable of the wheat and tares. It says, "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? Then how does it have tares?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' The servant said to him, 'Do you want us to go then and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. But let both grow together until harvest, until a time. And at that time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles and burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" All right? Judgment's coming. It's not going to come on our own time. His friends did not understand that there was a final judgment. They thought that that judgment had to happen here on the earth, and that judgment was happening currently to Job. All right, the third lesson that we need to unlearn from Job is they believed that there was no innocent suffering. They believed you had to have done something wrong to suffer. In their world, only the wicked perish, only the good prosper. They could not stand Job maintaining that he was righteous because the righteous couldn't suffer. If the righteous suffered, their moral world fell apart. Eliphaz said it in Job 4:7. He said, "Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished?" He said, innocent people don't perish. Innocent people don't have bad things happen to them. You had to have done something wrong. They didn't realize that sometimes there can be innocent suffering. All right, Job couldn't have known at the time that his innocent suffering showed God's wisdom far more deeply than he or his friends could ever explain in words. We're talking about it now. It's lasted thousands of years so that we can learn from Job's suffering. There was a point behind it. On the cross, Jesus, though innocent, perished for the guilty. All right? He was falsely accused by a bunch of wise people, Pharisees and Sadducees. He was abandoned by his friends. He was tormented. He was stripped naked. He was abused. He was murdered. He perished so that we wouldn't have to. All right? Innocent people suffer. Job suffered. He was blameless in God's sight. Jesus suffered. And it's all for God's purpose. All right? So for them, there was no final judgment. All right? But for us, there is a final judgment. All right? And what we have as Christians to look forward to is that final judgment's already been taken care of. God sent his son to die. And he said in John 15:13, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." Jesus came and died so that we don't have to suffer. Now, does that mean suffering's not going to happen? No, we see it throughout Job's story. He's blameless and suffering's still happening to him. But it's for a reason. It's for a greater purpose that God has for him. All right, so with all that said, we've talked about what his friends did right, what his friends did wrong. How are we going to respond? Let's look a little bit at how Job responded. These are his words. In Job 13:15, he said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him." He said, though he slay me, I will trust him. All right? He knew that God was sovereign. All right? He did not believe that this had necessarily come from God, that God was doing this to him, but he knew that God had control. All right? He knew he was sovereign. And then in Job 19:25-26, he said, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God." He knew that there was a better end result. And I don't have this one up there, but I read it this morning and thought I wanted to put it up there, but I didn't. Job 23. Verses 11-14, he says, "My foot has held fast his steps. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food." I've treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. "But he is unique, and who can make him change? And whatsoever his soul desires, that he does. For he performs what is appointed for me. And many such things are with him." He performs what is appointed for me. God's in control. All right? He is in control. Now, we can also look in the New Testament and look at Paul in hardships. And I read this, those of you who were here last week, I read this to you last week. But he said, "Brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." Paul knew the story of Job. Paul had also been imprisoned. He had been beaten. He had been scourged for his faith. He said, "Count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all liberally without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not the man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." We need to ask the Lord for things, but he may not give them. You know why? Because he has a better purpose. He may know that we don't need those things. Count it all joy when trials come upon you. And I know that's hard. Like I said, I'm talking about things that I'm learning as well. All right. Now, some final thoughts. These were obviously Job's best friends. All right. And we often need to listen to the counsel of our best friends. But it goes on for chapter after chapter, and I didn't have time to go into all of that, obviously, of his friends giving him bad counsel, saying that he's done this and saying that he's done that and telling him he needs to repent. And Job's like, "I have not done anything wrong." All right, so we need to listen to our friends, but we should always weigh what is said to us, either through a friend, through a colleague, through even a pastor, a counselor. We need to weigh all of those things against Scripture and who we know God to be. If somebody's giving you counsel and you think it sounds like a good idea, but it violates Scripture, it's not right. Period. If somebody's telling you something and it goes against who you know God to be, it's not right. And so Job knew his friends were wrong in telling him that he had sinned. We need to be able to identify that stuff. And the way we do that is by having a strong, right relationship with Christ. All right, so remember the attributes of God seen in Job's story. That God's sovereign over evil. Remember, there is evil at work against us. All right? Remember that God limits the actions of the enemy. He's not going to give us more than he can handle. Okay? There are times when we think he's given us more than we can handle, but he's never given us more than he can handle. All right? He limits the actions of the enemy. He told Satan, "Don't touch his body." Then Satan came back and said, "I bet I can make him turn on you." He said, "Just don't kill him." All right? So he can limit the actions of the enemy. And every action the enemy took against Job ultimately served God's purpose. Remember, God will judge, all right? Not in our time, but in his. And in due season, his purposes will be made known. And honestly, this is something hard to accept. We may never know the reason that something happened to us in this life. But when we get to heaven and see somebody else up there that says, "You know, when you were going through such and so, and I saw you standing firm on your faith, that's the reason I'm here right now. Because I saw you had faith in something that I wanted." And we may never see that here on earth. But our suffering is doing something for God's kingdom if we're following him. All right? His purposes. All right, so I entitled this, "Consider My Servant." Notice I didn't complete the name there. in verse 1, it says, when Satan is talking to God, God says, consider my servant Job. All right, put yourself in that situation. Would God be able to put our name there? Would he be able to say, consider my servant Gabe? He's not going to turn on me. That was tough for me when I thought about that, turning it back on myself. I was like, wait a minute now. Don't make me turn that back on myself. I don't want to lose everything. But consider my servant. All right, would he put your name there if asked? All right, and then how do we respond to those in need? Are we going to be like Job's friends at the beginning who came and did everything they needed to? All right. Are we going to hear? Are we going to coordinate and come? Are we going to show the appropriate emotions? Are we going to mourn with them, stay with them? And are we only going to speak when prompted by God? Or are we going to be like Job's friends after they start talking and try to turn somebody essentially away from God? We need to be ready to have an answer when suffering comes. And we need to be able to tell people with assurance that that suffering is for a greater purpose. It's for God's greater purpose. And we're not going to have the answers. That's what's so difficult. Sometimes we're not going to have the answers. Lane, you can go ahead and come on up. We're not going to have the answers to why something happened to us. And that's difficult. It's hard. I don't like it. I want the answer. All right, and we all do. But the one answer we all know we have has already been answered, and that is God wins. All right? God not only won with Jesus on the cross, he's going to win in the end. And he's going to protect us as his servants. Would you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for what it teaches us, whether it be comfortable or not. I thank you that it's there so that we can learn from you. Despite what we may want to happen, despite what we may believe we deserve, Lord, you have the ultimate purpose. Lord, you know what's going to happen with us in the end. You know what's going to happen with the accuser in the end. And you are sovereign over all of that. And we thank you for that. We thank you that when we can't trust anyone else, when our friends turn the wrong way, we can still trust you. And you're still going to be there for us. And Father, I pray for each of us as we go today that we be the good friend, that we hear people's problems, that we answer in appropriate ways. We can mourn with, we can come, we can do for those people. And Lord, when it's time, you give us the words to say. And if we don't have the right ones, shut our mouths. Because, Lord, we want to lead people to you. Thank you for all these things, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.